You notice I had Peter on my mind. It's sort of cruel the way that this lectionary text today pairs St. Peter with St. Thomas. And not even just ordinary run-of-the-mill St. Peter. This is sort of Peter at his best. This incredible sermon in the Acts of the Apostles and the reading from his epistle, paired with Thomas, sort of at his worst. There's a cartoon that I've seen that depicts St. Peter and St. Thomas, probably in heaven at the pearly gates. And St. Thomas sort of has his hands up in despair and says, "Why do they not call you denying Peter? Why am I doubting Thomas?" Thomas has certainly sort of gotten the short end of the stick through the years. But it's easy and tempting to define people by their worst moments, by their flaws, by their mistakes. It may be a coworker who misses some important deadline. Every time after that, you're going to be following after them. Do you have the project ready? Don't forget, it's due this Friday. Or the child who forgets their jacket at school one day. Every day after that, when they have their jacket, you're going to be sure to remind them, be sure to bring your jacket home. Don't forget your coat at school. They're never going to outlive that moment. Or the spouse who one time forgets to finish the dishes before going to bed. Every night after that, did you remember the dishes? Did you finish the dishes? Don't forget to finish all the dishes. Never outlive it. Or far more seriously, the broken relationship where trust can never be found again. Or the ex-felon who can never find work because that is always following them around them. It's easy to define people by their mistakes, by their weakest moments. And certainly doubting Thomas has been defined by this moment of weakness, his flaw, his mistake. Many of us are probably familiar with this story. Thomas, of course, was the one disciple who stubbornly refused to believe until he saw with his own eyes the risen Christ. Silly Thomas, if only he had listened to the other disciples. But no, he just had to see for himself. After all, seeing is believing, so he has to ask the questions and he has to make sure. But if you really look at Thomas, is he so much different than the other disciples? Remember back to the Easter story in the Gospel of John. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and she found it empty. So she ran back and told Peter and John. But did they immediately believe her? No. They had to run to the tomb for themselves. And it wasn't until they went inside the tomb and saw the cloth and the linens lying in the empty tomb that they believed. But even then, what did they believe? That Jesus was risen? No. We're told they did not understand the scriptures that he must rise from the dead. So they return home knowing only that the tomb is empty. And even Mary, when Jesus appears to her directly, she doesn't recognize him at first. And after she does recognize him, she goes back and tells the disciples. But we're not given no indication that the disciples believed her. And in fact, the other Gospels tell us explicitly that they did not. Luke writes, "These words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." And then we get to this passage for today. And what happens? The disciples, of course, are locked in a room. And Jesus comes and stands among them. Seeing Jesus, do they immediately cry out in belief? No. And then Jesus says, "Peace be with you." And now do they proclaim his resurrection? It says, then after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. So are these really the faithful disciples of whom Thomas is the only skeptic? Certainly not. All of the disciples need proof to believe. All of them need to see Jesus. All of them need to hear Jesus. And all of them need to see the evidence of his bodily resurrection. It's only after they see this proof that they rejoice. And of course, after they believe, they tell Thomas. But Thomas still wants proof for himself. Sure, no one believed Mary Magdalene, but she was just one person. Now Thomas has the word of 10 people, all of them disciples. So why would he still not doubt? What else do we know about Thomas? Has he always been such a bad disciple? There isn't really much in the Gospels about him. He's mentioned in the lists of disciples in all of the Gospels, but aside from this, he's only mentioned 2 other times, and both are in the Gospel of John. One is when Jesus insists on going to Judea after the death of Lazarus. The disciples know this is not a good idea. The last time Jesus went to Judea, the Jews tried to kill him. But Jesus is determined. And so Thomas says then, "Let us go, that we may die with Jesus." This doesn't really sound like the same Thomas we know from today's gospel, the doubting Thomas, the stubborn, hard-headed Thomas. This is a Thomas of courage and conviction. And again, Thomas appears in John chapter 14. And this is a little bit more like the Thomas we're familiar with, the questioning Thomas. Jesus utters the beautiful words that have brought so much comfort in numerous funerals. "Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. You know the way to the place where I am going." All of the disciples heard this. All of the disciples heard Jesus say these words. But none of them say anything. None of them seem to understand what he's talking about and are confused. Where is this place you're going? How could we possibly know the way when we don't know where you're going? And only Thomas has the courage and audacity to voice that confusion that all of the disciples are feeling. Thomas says to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" And in response to Thomas's courage and honesty, his willingness to voice the confusion and uncertainty of all the disciples, Jesus utters the words that have been beloved and memorized for 2,000 years. "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." So Thomas has just been told by Jesus himself that by seeing Jesus, he has seen God. So then, when the disciples tell him 3 days after the crucifixion that they have seen Jesus alive, is it any wonder then that Thomas wants to see for himself? He knows what seeing Jesus means, because seeing Jesus means seeing God. And Thomas waited. He waited for a week in the midst of the other disciples. He waited in community, even as he was unsure and maybe still doubting. He remained in the fellowship of the disciples. Perhaps this is a story less about Thomas doubting and more about Thomas hoping, even with this uncertainty. While he didn't yet believe in the resurrected Lord, he did hope. What else could have kept him there for a week, as all the other disciples are telling him that Jesus is risen, and he continues to doubt it? Why would he stay there with them? He remained there among them because he hoped that their testimony would prove true. There are many representations of this passage in art, but one of my favorites that I've come across is by the Italian Baroque artist Caravaggio. It's called The Incredulity of Thomas. In it, Jesus appears to Thomas, and Thomas is leaned over looking intently at Jesus' wounds as he thrusts his fingers into Jesus' side. But what's especially striking is that in this painting, Jesus is not viewing Thomas accusingly. He has no expression on his face that says, "There, are you finally satisfied?" Or, "Is this what it'll take to convince you?" But Jesus is looking down at Thomas and guiding his hand into the hole in his side. He offers himself as physical proof. Now, it can seem like the words at the end of this passage are kind of chastising Thomas. Blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. So I guess Jesus forgives Thomas for wanting to make sure, but now Jesus is saying that those who really believe won't need that kind of proof. But you have to remember, Thomas didn't only believe what he had seen. Thomas also believed what he did not see. Thomas has seen someone come back from the dead before. He was there when Jesus raised Lazarus. Being alive after being dead does not necessarily mean being God. But the key for Thomas is that he knows the implications of what he has seen. He believes that Jesus is not only alive, but also is God. The other disciples rejoice at seeing Jesus alive. But Thomas is the only one that proclaims, "My Lord and my God." And it's from Thomas's honesty, vulnerability about his own uncertainty and doubts that he makes this powerful proclamation. The Christian faith will always face challenges from those who claim it cannot stand up to scrutiny. John seems to say as much in the sentences at the end of this passage. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Clearly, John knows that, like Thomas, we are going to need evidence for our faith. And he provides it. So may we, just as Thomas, be courageous enough to be vulnerable within this community, to be honest in our times of doubt and uncertainty, that though it may be painful for a season, Jesus, again like Thomas, will guide our hands to his wounds so that we might cry out, "My Lord and my God."